You called humanity a statistical error. Your models proved it. Your star science was clear. Their little blue world was a cosmic mistake. It orbited a dangerously unstable star. It had a wildly oversized moon. This moon created chaotic tides and weather. Their planet was a soup of improbable chemistry. Life should not have taken root there. And yet, it did. You studied them from the safety of your orbital observatories. You watched their unlikely evolution unfold. They were fragile things made of soft tissue. Their skeletons were laughably weak. They required a specific atmosphere to even breathe. Their survival was a constant, desperate fight. It was a fight they should have lost 1,000,000 times over. Their existence was a rounding error in the grand equation of the universe, a bug in the code of reality. You watched, and you waited. You expected them to vanish like so many other failed experiments. They were a temporary anomaly, a fleeting whisper of chaos. They would soon be corrected by the silent, unforgiving logic of space. But they did not vanish. They thrived. They built things. They reached for their chaotic moon. You labeled their file the human problem. Your species had long ago purged such things. Emotion was a chemical flaw, a vestige of primitive biology. You watched humans weep at simple sounds they called music. The frequencies contained no data. They conveyed no tactical information. Yet, their eyes would leak saline solution. Their bodies would shake with an illogical response. It was a baffling waste of resources. You saw them fight for impossible causes. They waged wars for ideas, for flags, for beliefs, for honor. These were abstract concepts with no physical value. Your species fought only for resources or survival. Every conflict was a logical calculation. Humans would sacrifice everything for something that did not exist. They would die for a dream. They kept other, lesser creatures as companions. They called them pets. These animals offered no protein. They provided no labor. In fact, the humans expended resources on them. They fed them, sheltered them, and cared for their health. All for a neurochemical reaction they called love. It was collective madness on a planetary scale, a puzzle with no logical solution. You saw them laugh until they could not breathe. They laughed at their own failures. They found humor in falling down. It was an inefficient response to a negative event. A fall could mean injury or death. The correct response was analysis and caution. The human response was to get up and make a joke about it. You had to admit, that part was strangely compelling. When your first progenitor fleet arrived, it was a moment of perfect order. 100 ships entered their system in a flawless sphere formation. You broadcast the universal greeting, the prime numbers followed by the hydrogen spectrum. It was a signal of pure logic, a statement of intelligence. You expected a similar, calculated reply. You were not prepared for what you received. They answered your mathematical purity with a beautiful, illogical mess. Their reply began with your own greeting, confirming they understood. Then came the chaos. They sent images of their art. They sent recordings of their symphonies. They sent the works of their poets in 1,000 different languages. They sent the genetic code of a tree. They sent a mother's lullaby to her child. It was the most inefficient data transfer in galactic history. 99% of the information was strategically useless. It was a portrait of a species that reveled in its own beautiful flaws. Your analysts worked for cycles trying to find a pattern. They found none. The human welcome was a paradox, an invitation wrapped in a riddle. It was a heartfelt, illogical, wonderful greeting. Your concord was the apex of civilization, a society built on a foundation of pure reason. For eons you had cultivated a universe of serene order. Every action was weighed, every decision was calculated for the most optimal outcome. There were no surprises. There was no art, no poetry, no song. These things were beautifully inefficient, and therefore, they were gone. Your cities were marvels of geometric perfection, towers of crystal and light, arranged in flawless patterns. Your citizens moved with a quiet, purposeful grace. There was no wasted energy, no loud noises, no sudden movements. Life was a predictable, harmonious equation, a steady, unwavering hum of productivity and peace. It was everything a civilization should be. You had solved the riddles of star science. You could plot the course of a comet for the next 1,000,000 years. You could engineer planets and redirect the light of stars. The universe was a great machine, and you were its masters. You had accounted for every variable. You had a procedure for every contingency. You thought you had seen everything. You thought you were prepared for anything. Then a silence fell upon the outer stars. It began at the edge of the galactic arm. A listening post simply went quiet. Then another. Then an entire sector. It was not a declaration of war. It was not the energy signature of a rival power. It was just nothing. A spreading patch of absolute emptiness where stars and worlds used to be. A void that was growing. Your probes reported impossible readings. Space itself was being unmade. The fundamental laws of physics were being erased. This was not an enemy you could reason with. It was not a force you could negotiate with. It was a hunger from beyond the veil of reality. A shadow that consumed light, matter, and life itself. It consumed everything. Your star science had no explanation for it. Your models broke when they tried to simulate it. The shadow was a null factor, an impossibility that was currently eating your galaxy. For the first time in 10,000 generations, your leaders felt an echo of a forgotten thing, a ghost of an emotion you had no name for. It was the cold, clean logic of fear. Your grand fleets met the shadow in the Orion sector. 10,000 warships, the pride of the conquered. They were arranged in the perfect Logrian 5 formation, a strategy that had never failed. Their shields were synchronized, their weapons were calibrated to perfection. Every ship, every officer, every tactical calculation was flawless. It was the ultimate expression of logical warfare. The shadow did not care for your perfection. It did not have fleets to engage. It did not have weapons to counter. It was a vast, formless cloud of utter blackness. Your weapons fired into it. Beams of pure energy, lances of focused gravity, missiles that could crack a moon. The energy simply vanished. There was no explosion, no impact, just nothing. Then the shadow touched your outer screen of ships. They did not explode. They simply ceased to exist. One moment, a mighty battleship was there. The next, there was only empty space. The perfect Logrian 5 formation dissolved into panic. Ships broke formation, their logical captains overwhelmed by an illogical foe. The shadow flowed over them like a tide. It did not fight your fleet. It erased it. The retreat was a disaster. Perfect logic turned into a desperate, chaotic flight. Your grand fleets were broken. Your greatest weapons were useless. Your flawless strategies were meaningless scribbles. The shadow did not follow the rules. It was a context error in the code of the universe, a problem that logic could not solve. The Concord, the bastion of order, was losing. With your fleets shattered, a cold despair settled over the Concord. Your councils ran simulations for weeks. Every single one ended in the same outcome. total extinction. The shadow was expanding. It would reach your core worlds in less than 50 cycles. Logic dictated that your civilization was over. There was no path to victory. It was High Executor Tollus who spoke the unthinkable. He was ancient, his mind a repository of millennia of data. He stood before the silent council. His voice was the first to break the hum of the logic engines. He spoke of the anomaly, the statistical error on the third planet of a forgotten yellow star, the one illogical element in your ordered galaxy. He proposed the unthinkable. He suggested you ask for help, from them, from the chaotic, emotional, unpredictable creatures you had dismissed as a cosmic joke. The council chamber was silent for a long time. The idea was repellent. It was an admission of failure on a fundamental level. It was the last, most desperate move on the board. The Concord was a monument to reason, and reason had failed. With all logical options exhausted, you were left with only the illogical. You turned your sensors toward that small, noisy blue world. You sent a message, not of conquest or of observation, but of supplication. The problem might be the only answer you had left. You arrived in their system with what remained of your fleet, a handful of broken, scarred vessels. You transmitted your request. You laid bare the data of the shadow. You showed them the recordings of your fleet's annihilation. You expected them to be terrified. You expected them to offer a military pact. You expected a negotiation for ships and weapons and technology. You expected logic. The humans listened to your plea in silence. Their leaders convened in a great global forum. You watched them debate. They argued. They shouted. They pleaded with one another. It was a chaotic, messy process. It was so very human. Finally, they gave you their answer. It was not the answer you expected. They did not offer you weapons. They did not offer you ships. They offered you a song and a gamble. Their top military leader, a woman they called General Eva Rostova, explained it. Her voice was firm, but her eyes held a light you did not recognize. She spoke of a weapon you had no concept for, a weapon forged not of steel, but of spirit. They offered you hope. You analyzed their plan. It was, from a logical standpoint, complete and utter madness. It was based on a chemical emotion, a fleeting neurochemical reaction that defied all tactical sense. Their strategy depended on concepts like courage, sacrifice, and defiance. These were not battlefield metrics. They were the stuff of poetry, the fictions of a primitive species. The core of their plan was something called hope. You ran the data through your most powerful computers. Hope did not register as a quantifiable force. It could not be weaponized. It could not deflect a particle beam. It was a collective, species-wide delusion, a shared psychosis. You saw it as the final, desperate act of a doomed race. Yet, you watched them prepare. Their entire planet mobilized, not with grim efficiency, but with a loud, vibrant energy. They sang as they worked. They painted symbols on their ships. They broadcast messages of defiance to each other. They were facing the same existential threat as you, the same inevitable extinction. But they did not despair. They prepared for their final act with a terrible, beautiful joy. Your observers labeled it cascade emotional failure. But as you watched them, a new, unwelcome thought entered your calculations. What if this illogical madness was the only thing the shadow would understand? What if the only way to fight a void was with a soul? Their plan was terrifyingly simple. It was also suicidally insane. They would not fight the shadow at the edges of their system. They would not meet it in the void between worlds. They would lure it home. They would make their own homeworld, their precious, chaotic cradle of life, the bait, a lure for a thing that devoured gods. They began a broadcast. It was not a warning. It was not a challenge. It was an invitation. They gathered every scrap of their culture, every song ever written, every painting ever made, every scientific discovery, every whispered word of love. They compressed it all into a single, radiant signal, a beacon of pure, concentrated life. They aimed it directly at the approaching darkness. The signal was a symphony of what it meant to be human. It was birth and death, joy and sorrow, war and peace. It was the taste of their food, the feeling of sunlight on their skin, the sound of a child's laughter. It was everything illogical and wonderful and terrible about them. They were offering up their entire existence, a feast for the void. You watched this act of collective madness and felt your logic processors strain. By all calculations, this would only hasten their demise. It was like a small animal singing to attract a predator. And yet, the shadow responded. It changed course. It ignored a dozen of your own colony worlds. It moved with unnerving speed, directly toward Earth. You witnessed the symphony of sacrifice begin. As the shadow entered their system, the human fleet met it. It was a laughable force. A few hundred ships against an enemy that had consumed a galactic arm. Their ships were small, their weapons weak. They stood no chance. You knew it. They knew it. And they flew out anyway. They did not engage in perfect formations. They flew in chaotic, individualistic patterns. One ship, a tiny fighter, flew straight at the void. Over its open comms channel, it blasted a piece of ancient music, a driving, defiant rhythm of drums and electric guitar. The fighter was erased in a silent flash. But for a moment, the darkness had a soundtrack. Another squadron of ships flew in a sweeping, graceful arc. Their engine trails painted a fleeting image in the void, a flower. Then they overloaded their reactors. A brief, beautiful starburst against the infinite night. They were not fighting to win. They were fighting to be seen. They were shouting their existence into the uncaring emptiness. You saw pilots draw pieces of the shadow into suicidal traps. They lured them into asteroid fields. They dragged them into the crushing gravity of their gas giants. Each act was a final, defiant gesture. A single note in a grand, tragic opera. They were not just dying. They were performing. They were turning their extinction into a work of art. Then came the final act. One impossible act. As the shadow began to touch Earth's atmosphere, a single ship moved forward. It was an old vessel. One of their first interstellar probes, refitted and renamed. They called it the Wanderer. It was small, unarmed, and ancient by your standards. It flew slowly, deliberately, into the very heart of the shadow. It did not fire a weapon. It did not raise its shields. Its mission was not to fight. Its mission was to speak. The ship broadcast a single piece of data, not a symphony, not a poem, not a grand, sweeping history of their species. It was a simple, raw, unedited memory. The memory of a single human. It was the memory of a young father. He was holding his newborn daughter for the first time. The recording was from his own eyes, the tiny, fragile creature in his arms, the overwhelming, illogical flood of emotion, the fierce, protective love, the sudden, gut-wrenching understanding that he would die for this small, helpless being. The pain and the beauty of that love, intertwined. A perfect, impossible moment. The ship broadcast this memory on all frequencies. It pushed this single tiny spark of pure humanity into the cold, empty heart of the void. And then, the wanderer was gone. For a long moment, there was only silence, a silence after the song. The shadow had consumed the ship. It had consumed the memory. It continued to press down on Earth's atmosphere. The human gamble had failed. Your logic had been correct all along. Chaos could not defeat the void. But then, something happened. The great shadow recoiled. It pulled back from the planet's edge as if it had been burned. A tremor ran through its formless mass, a shudder that had no physical cause. It was a reaction you had never seen. It was not retreating from a weapon. It was flinching from a feeling. The shadow, the entity that had consumed stars and galaxies without pause, seemed confused. It had absorbed the energy of a supernova without effect. But this tiny sliver of human emotion, this love, this pain, this sacrifice, it was poison. It was an algorithm it could not compute, a pain it could not understand. The shadow, the great hunger from beyond, turned and fled. It fled from a memory. Your star science was shattered. Your entire understanding of the universe lay in ruins. For eons, you had believed that logic was the ultimate force. That reason was the highest state of being. You had built a civilization on the cold, hard certainty of mathematics. And you had been proven wrong. Spectacularly, undeniably wrong. The human equation was never meant to be solved. It was a paradox you had tried to quantify, a chaotic variable you had tried to eliminate. You had viewed their emotions as a weakness, a flaw in their design. But that flaw, that illogical, inefficient, beautiful flaw, was the most powerful weapon in the galaxy. It had saved you when your own perfection had failed. You looked at the data again, the memory from the wanderer, the father's love, the daughter's cry. It was an act of creation and a promise of sacrifice in the same instant. It was a concept the shadow, a being of pure consumption, could not process. It was like feeding a number to a creature that only eats silence. The paradox had broken it. A new calculus was needed. You no longer see them as a problem. You do not call them the human anomaly anymore. You watch them now with something that feels disturbingly like respect. They are rebuilding. They are mourning their dead with sorrow and celebrating their survival with joy. Their world is still a chaotic, noisy, illogical mess. And it is the most beautiful thing you have ever seen. The Concord has begun to change. For the first time in millennia, a poet's words were read in the silent council. A composer has begun to craft a melody to honor the fallen. It is a slow, uncertain process. You are learning to embrace the variables. You are learning that not every problem has a logical solution. The shadow is still out there in the deep darkness between galaxies. It may one day return, but you are no longer afraid, because you know the universe now holds a new kind of power, an unpredictable, unquantifiable defense. They were once the question that threatened your orderly existence. Now, you understand. They are the chaos that keeps the order alive. You used to call it the human problem. Now, you call it the human solution.